The history of the lands that became the United States began with the arrival of the first people in the Americas around 15,000 BC. Numerous indigenous cultures formed, and many saw transformations in the 16th century away from more densely populated lifestyles and towards reorganized polities elsewhere. The European colonization of the Americas began in the late 15th century, however most colonies in what would later become the United States were settled after 1600. By the 1760s, the 13 British colonies contained 2.5 million people and were established along the Atlantic coast east of the Appalachian Mountains. The southern colonies built an agricultural system on slave labor, importing slaves from Africa for this purpose. After defeating France, the British government imposed a series of taxes, including the Stamp Act of 1765, rejecting the colonists' constitutional argument that new taxes needed their approval. Resistance to these taxes, especially the Boston Tea Party in 1773, led to Parliament issuing punitive laws designed to end self-government. Armed conflict began in Massachusetts in 1775 1776. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress declared the independence of the colonies as the United States. Led by General George Washington, it won the Revolutionary War. The Peace Treaty of 1783 established the borders of the new sovereign state. The Articles of Confederation established a central government, but it was ineffectual at providing stability as it could not collect taxes and had no executive officer. A convention wrote a new constitution that was adopted in 1789, and a Bill of Rights was added in 1791 to guarantee inalienable rights. With Washington as the first president and Alexander Hamilton his chief advisor, a strong central government was created. Purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803 doubled the size of the United States. Encouraged by the notion of manifest destiny, the United States expanded to the Pacific coast. While the nation was large in terms of area, its population in 1790 was only 4 million. Westward expansion was driven by a quest for inexpensive land for yeoman farmers and slave owners. The expansion of slavery was increasingly controversial and fueled political and constitutional battles, which were resolved by compromises. Slavery was abolished in all states north of the Mason-Dixon line by 1804, but states in the South continued the institution to support the kinds of large-scale agriculture that dominated the Southern economy. Precipitated by the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860, the Civil War began as the Southern states seceded from the Union to form their own pro-slavery country, the Confederate States of America. The defeat of the Confederates in 1865 led to the abolition of slavery. In the Reconstruction era following the war, legal and voting rights were extended to freed male slaves. The national government emerged much stronger and gained explicit duty to protect individual rights. However, when white Southern Democrats regained their political power in the South in 1877, often by paramilitary suppression of voting, they passed Jim Crow laws to maintain white supremacy, as well as new state constitutions that legalized discrimination based on race and prevented most African Americans from participating in public life. The United States became the world's leading industrial power at the turn of the 20th century. Due to an outburst of entrepreneurship and industrialization and the arrival of millions of immigrant workers and farmers, a national railroad network was completed and large-scale mines and factories were established. Mass dissatisfaction with corruption, inefficiency, and traditional politics stimulated the progressive movement from the 1890s to the 1920s, leading to reforms, including the federal income tax, direct election of senators, granting of citizenship to many indigenous people, alcohol prohibition, and women's suffrage. Initially neutral during World War I, the United States declared war on Germany in 1917 and funded the Allied victory the following year. After the prosperous Roaring Twenties, the Wall Street crash of 1929 marked the onset of the decade-long worldwide Great Depression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt implemented his New Deal programs, including relief for the unemployed, support for farmers, Social Security, and a minimum wage. The New Deal defined modern American liberalism. 1. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered World War II and financed the Allied war effort, and helped defeat Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in the European theater. Its involvement culminated in using newly American-invented nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to defeat Imperial Japan in the Pacific War. This article is part of a series on the culture of the United States, Greater Coat of Arms of the United States. SVG, Society, History, Language, People, Race and Ethnicity, Religion, Arts and Literature, Architecture, Art, Dance, Fashion, Literature, Comics, Poetry, Music, Sculpture, Theater, Other, Cuisine, Festivals, Folklore, Media, Newspapers, Radio, Cinema, TV, Internet, Americana, Mythology, Sports, Symbols, Flag, Great Seal, Monuments, Motto, Anthem, Bird, World Heritage Sites, Flag of the United States, 19 to 10. SVG, United States Portal, VEET. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers in the aftermath of World War II. During the Cold War, the two countries confronted each other indirectly in the arms race, the space race, propaganda campaigns, and proxy wars. In the 1960s, in large part due to the strength of the civil rights movement, another wave of social reforms was enacted which enforced the constitutional rights of voting and freedom of movement to African Americans. The Cold War ended when the Soviet Union was officially dissolved, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. Foreign policy after the Cold War has often focused on conflicts in the Middle East, especially after the September 11 attacks. Early in the 21st century, the United States experienced the Great Recession and the COVID-19 pandemic, which had a negative effect on the local economy. Prehistory, main articles, Prehistory of the United States, History of Native Americans in the United States, and Pre-Columbian Era. See also, Native Americans in the United States, Approximate Location of the Ice-Free Corridor and Specific Paleo-Indian Sites, Clovis Theory. It is not definitively known how or when Native Americans first settled the Americas and the present-day United States. The prevailing theory proposes that people from Eurasia followed game across Beringia, a land bridge that connected Siberia to present-day Alaska during the Ice Age, and then spread southward throughout the Americas. This migration may have begun as early as 30,000 years ago, too, and continued through to about 10,000 years ago, when the land bridge became submerged by the rising sea level caused by the melting glaciers. 3. These early inhabitants, called Paleo-Indians, soon diversified into hundreds of culturally distinct nations and tribes. This pre-Columbian era incorporates all periods in the history of the Americas before the appearance of European influences on the American continents, spanning from the original settlement in the Upper Paleolithic period to European colonization during the early modern period. While the term technically refers to the era before Christopher Columbus' voyage in 1492, in practice the term usually includes the history of American indigenous cultures until they were conquered or significantly influenced by Europeans, even if this happened decades or centuries after Columbus's initial landing. Paleo-Indians, main article, Pre-Columbian North America. The cultural areas of pre-Columbian North America, according to Alfred Kroeber, by 10,000 BCE, humans were relatively well established throughout North America. Originally, Paleo-Indians hunted Ice Age megafauna like mammoths, but as they began to go extinct, people turned instead to bison as a food source. As time went on, foraging for berries and seeds became an important alternative to hunting. Paleo-Indians in central Mexico were the first in the Americas to farm, starting to plant corn, beans, and squash around 8000 BCE. Eventually, the knowledge began to spread northward. By 3000 BCE, corn was being grown in the valleys of Arizona and New Mexico, followed by primitive irrigation systems and early villages of the Hohokam. 5. 6. One of the earlier cultures in the present-day United States was the Clovis culture, who are primarily identified by the use of fluted spear points, called the Clovis point. From 9100 to 8850 BCE, the culture ranged over much of North America and also appeared in South America. Artifacts from this culture were first excavated in 1932 near Clovis, New Mexico. The Folsom culture was similar, but is marked by the use of the Folsom Point, a later migration identified by linguists, anthropologists, and archaeologists occurred around 8000 BCE. This included Nadine-speaking peoples, who reached the Pacific Northwest by 5000 BCE. 7. From there, they migrated along the Pacific coast and into the interior and constructed large multi-family dwellings in their villages, which were used only seasonally in the summer to hunt and fish, and in the winter to gather food supplies. 8. Another group, the Oshara tradition people, who lived from 5500 BCE to 600 CE, were part of the archaic Southwest, mound builders and pueblos. 1058, the first corn, folktale, from the Pawnee people. Maize was the staple crop for Native American agriculture. Main articles, mound builders and ancestral Puebloans.